Hey, what's up, everybody? Good afternoon. I hope you're doing well. Don't judge me. It's really cold here. And, well, my ears are cold, and so I'm wearing a hood. But we're going to continue discussing information processing today. And what's really nice about this conversation is that we'll take a look at some specific models of information processing, and then we'll return to some of the examples, the descriptions that we had on Wednesday, and we'll highlight the parts that kind of illustrate that model or that fit with that model. And this will have us thinking about the different assumptions the models make about information and the information search that voters engage in. We also think about how voters make choices with the information that they obtain. And eventually, I'd like us to step back and have a conversation together about maybe what model your own information processing conforms to, and then the implications for parties and politicians seeking to win your vote. Let's think about then information from your perspective as well as from the perspective of the party and the politician. Um, Before we get started, does anyone have any comments or does anyone want to say hello? Hello. I'm doing really well. I'm having a good day. I'm a little tired. It's been a long week, and I'm sure that you all are also a little tired, but it's been a good one, and we're holding together. So I'm in a different room today, and it's a little bit more quiet here in this room. Hopefully, it'll be easier for me to focus. Sometimes the building is so loud that it's just challenging to teach from home. But it's great to see you all, and so happy that you're here tonight and that we're going to be discussing this very important topic. Let's get started without further ado. So, our discussion is going to be framed by these four models of information processing. Whenever we talk about the ways that voters decide and how they arrive at the choice they make, implicitly or explicitly, we make assumptions about how they are processing information and how they're thinking about information, how much information they're obtaining in the first place, what sorts of indicators they use if they're choosing to focus on only some pieces of information and not all pieces, and so on and so forth. And the different models can be enumerated, and we can identify four of them. And these four differ in terms of some of those key assumptions. And the first model is the rational choice model. And this is most consistent with economic voting, as we call it. And you'll see in a moment that rational choice has everything to do with obtaining all of the relevant information and then making a decision based on an assessment of that information and using all of the available inputs that a voter might have, everything from newspapers to media, and everything and more. There's also socialization, which is related more to partisanship and party identification, and specifically the way that our formative influences, our parents, our upbringing, shape the way that we think about information. And so it's not just that we have a party identification, but we also view and interpret the information through that lens, through the lens of our partisanship, through the lens of our socialization, through the lens of those formative influences. This is very different than the economic model, which has more to do with that, obtaining of information and then the assessment based on objective metrics. Very different. The partisan model, more about bias and preconceived ideas about candidates and parties. But there's also a third model that you're less familiar with and that we haven't really talked about in this class. And we refer to this as or it's been called fast and frugal decision making. And this, like the name implies, as you'll see, has more to do with expediency and interpreting information in a limited and sort of incomplete way, but using certain heuristics or certain issues that might be deemed as more important by the voter, and that they therefore use to make a fast and frugal decision, as we would call it. You'll see an example of that as well. And then finally, there's bounded rationality, and this is sort of like intuitive decision making, or where individuals optimize under constraints, as we might call it. The idea is that they only have so much information; they don't have complete information, but they have enough to make a decision that involves an assessment of the costs and the benefits of the alternatives as they understand it based on that information they have. Granted that it is incomplete and it's not total or perfect. And that's why we use that term bounded. The idea is that we sort of have these blinders, so to speak, that limit how much information we actually assess, but that permit us to still make a decision that is rational, at least in the sense that we're weighing the costs and the benefits. And so, as I said, and as we'll explore, these different models differ in terms of the assumptions that they make about how we search for information. They differ in terms of the method of decision making, that is, how we sort of evaluate or interpret that information and make a decision based on it. They differ in terms of the motivations that go into the vote choice, but also into the choice regarding how much or what information to examine. And then they also differ in terms of the electoral inputs to all of these different choices or parts of the eventual vote choice. And so, as you can see, information plays an important role, and it's baked into all of these different perspectives, the different assumptions about information and how we seek it out and how we use it when we go to the polls and when we form our preferences that we eventually vote on the basis of. So let's take a look at some descriptions of these assumptions for the different models, and then we'll go back to those examples that we presented on Wednesday. And I've highlighted the specific parts that are consistent with these different assumptions that characterize the different models. And you'll see in short order how those descriptions line up with our understanding of these different forms of information processing. So the first model is the rational choice model. And this is all about being dispassionate and being sterile and being sort of scientific in your assessment of information that you collect in totality, so as to make a decision based on the costs and the benefits of the available alternatives. And the assumptions are pretty straightforward. These are classical sort of economic rational choice assumptions. The decision maker seeks out as much information as they possibly can about all of the available alternatives. And they do so until the cost of obtaining additional information exceeds the expected benefit. And so the idea is that people are rational, and they're rational in both the information they obtain and in the vote that they eventually cast. And they're rational so much so that the choice in the process of obtaining information is itself strategic. And the eventual method of decision making is very cognitive and sort of very conscious and intentional and explicit. And it has to do with this consideration of all of the positive and negative consequences associated with each alternative. It has to do with this sort of weighing of the costs and the benefits of different alternatives. And above all, it has to do with intentionality and this active, explicit choice and set of decisions made by the voter. Of course, the motivation for this is self-interest, right? Who's going to do all this work and obtain all this information and engage in this dispassionate analysis, for any reason apart from their own self-interest, just keeping it real? I'm sure there are some good Samaritans out there, but the neoclassical model demands this much from actors precisely because it views people as motivated by, their own bottom line in their own self-interest. And so it's I don't think it's a coincidence that the economic model has much, much more demanding expectations than some of the others that don't place as much emphasis on immediate self-interest. But let me not get too sidetracked here. Let's also discuss the electoral inputs to the decision. And so what pieces of information go into that decision that is shaped by this consideration of all of the possible or at least rationally obtained information. It has to do with, of course, performance. That could be retrospective and relate to things like job performance or policy and the performance of the economy. It can be prospective and involve forecasting, where you examine the issue stands of the candidates in their judgments about different issues. But really, the main criterion in all of these areas is a consideration of self-interest and a consideration of costs and benefits. So this rational choice model presents us with a world filled with people who are very decisive and intentional and information seeking and rational in their pursuit of information. And ultimately, they're motivated by self interest and they're driven by decisions made on the basis of retrospective evaluations and future judgments. But information plays the key role here because of how extensive the information is assumed to be and how much information the person has at their disposal. So you'll remember that our hypothetical voter who conformed to this model was William R. And William was our accountant from Rochester, New York, and he's that mathematical sort of demonic person. I say demonic because it sort of reminds me of Laplace's demon. Laplace's demon is this concept in physics about this all-seeing demon who's able to see and know everything, and therefore is able to render these kinds of judgments. William R is quite demonic in his capabilities, and in that regard, he is quite rational, and his choice and his process is very, very sterile and dispassionate in the same way that the rational choice model presents voters as sterile and dispassionate. I've gone ahead and I've highlighted in red the parts that align with the model and fit the model the most, and that really stand to highlight what kind of a voter William is. And so the part that I picked out was learn everything there is to know about the candidate's experience and policy proposals, and evaluate the likely consequences of those policies for his family and himself. So he's seeking everything there is to know. So he's seeking total, complete information, and then he's evaluating the consequences for himself and his family. And he could tell you the minutest detail, as I've highlighted here, suggesting that not only is his information complete, but that he is all capable in precisely the way that the rational choice model assumes voters truly are. And then finally, near the end, the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate are folded into overall summary evaluations. This clearly is a rational choice economic voter. And this kind of process, this sort of scientific approach to assessing the information, is the hallmark of the rational choice voter. Now, remember that this is a model, right? And a model of human behavior is really just a simplification and an idealization. And just like with a map that doesn't show every rock and every tree, a model of human behavior doesn't capture every wrinkle and every twist and every turn. And when it comes to these models, there may be no model that's more unrealistic than the rational choice model, because not only is it difficult for us to obtain all of the relevant information, but we're often swayed or influenced by that information based on some of our own preconceived ideas, even if we don't intentionally do that. Nevertheless, there's probably great value to the rational choice model because, for one, it stands in such stark contrast to some of the other approaches that are more predominant, frankly, like the partisan model and the socialization model. But before we continue, does anyone have a comment or a question about the rational choice approach or the rational choice mode of information processing? Yes, Christopher, this is economic voting. Rational choice models make the same assumptions and have the same views as the economic voting model. This is our economic voting example. Okay, so let's move forward and deal with our next one. So the second model that we'll consider is what's been referred to as the socialization model. And this is a model that is all about confirming preconceived notions or biases or existing ideas that have been formed and shaped by earlier influences. And this socialization approach puts an important emphasis then on early family and sort of contextual and upbringing factors that shape your views. This is the sociological approach. This is the Michigan school. But the Michigan school has a set of ideas about information that are often more implicit than in the case of the rational choice approach. Whereas rational choice makes very explicit assumptions about how well informed decision makers are, the socialization model really implies not just the opposite, but just doesn't have much to say about information. And really the implication of the model is that the information gathering process, to the extent that it happens, it's basically passive, meaning party identification is determined early. And to the extent that information is incorporated or absorbed, it's always filtered through that party ID lens. And it's interpreted and sort of viewed through this tunnel vision that is going to color the way that everything is interpreted. And what this means in turn is that exposure to information does come from the media, but it's inadvertent and it often has to do with passive consumption, right? Remember the passive attitudes and behavior that we discussed, media consumption, views or attitudes that are formed in response to events, but that don't involve an explicit or a direct kind of engagement in like the form of an active participation. The socialization model is all about passive participation and passive information gathering. And so it's all about bias and how influences that you're already sort of stuck with will shape and determine the information that you obtain, interpret, and how you view it and read it. And it's ultimately going to reproduce those early predispositions. This is the idea. This is the cognition in the psychology of early socialization. And so this is why earlier in the course I asked you that question, are we a product of our formative early influences, or can we break, from that path? And what we've yet to address is the role of information in how the consumption and interpretation of information either helps to reproduce the path or break us free from that path. And so then there are important questions about media and media consumption. And the method of decision making really has to do with these memory-based evaluations and short-term assessments of the different alternatives, always sort of retrospective and looking back in terms of that formative influence and those formative predispositions. And so what this means is that self-interest is not a consideration. People aren't necessarily concerned or motivated by a notion of self-interest. They're really mainly interested and concerned with cognitive consistency. They want there to be some stability in their decision making and in their processing, and they want consistency and continuity for the purpose of frankly, well, we might think of it as more comfortable and more familiar, and as closer to one and closer to oneself and their upbringing and their values and maybe their way of life and family and those early influences. And so the main electoral inputs are also very different than rational choice. Whereas rational choice is concerned with job performance issues, party ID is the main input, and issue stands become in turn sort of like icons or indicators that follow from the party ID. And sometimes there are evaluations or perceptions of the candidates, but that those evaluations are frequently themselves shaped and kind of filtered through a partisan disposition. And so in this model, information is all about confirming biases and confirming pre-existing notions and ideas. This is very different than the rational choice view of the individual voter in the individual's information processing. And you can see then that there are almost totally incompatible ideas here. These are two models that cannot be reconciled. And really, it's important to remember that, frankly, the sociological and socialization school set out to try to establish and argue that voters have limited information, and that because they have limited information, we should better understand their information processing or their process as being motivated by cues and those formative influences. The rational choice people, they think that voters have a great deal of info and are constantly obtaining more of it for the purpose of making the best choice. So let's take a look at Warren. And remember, I showed you this description, but I've gone ahead and highlighted the parts that tease out the role of those formative influences. And some of these are more obvious than others, but I think it's worth it to just note the parts that seem to peg Warren as a socialization processor, or a sociological or a partisan information processor. And so what I've highlighted here is the part that says he is a lifelong Democrat, as were his parents. The verb believes obviously is consistent with this notion of prior belief and predisposition shaping your processing. The verb trusts is also consistent with that kind of notion of prior predispositions and prior ideas shaping processing. As a Democrat, this kind of self-identification as a Democrat, right? It is shaping his processing of the information. It's not the case that he's obtaining info and arriving at this dispassionate or sterile choice. He's going into the process with in mind that he already belongs to the Democratic Party. And then finally, he uses that verb believes again. And so it seems pretty straightforward that this is a partisan sort of sociological voter, and one who is engaged in confirming existing ideas and is primarily motivated by cognitive consistency as opposed to self-interest. Let's take a look at the chat. Yes, this is partisan voting. A third model that we actually haven't discussed yet, and that differs from both the partisan and the economic voting models, is what's been referred to as a fast and frugal decision-making model. And this is slightly different than a rational choice model. It focuses primarily on efficiency. And the idea is that individuals should seek out only the information that they believe they really care about, or that they feel like is most indicative of the candidate as a whole. And everything else is ignored. And so what this usually means in practice is that voters are seeking out the particular positions of candidates on a few issues, just a few policy issues. And those issues that the voter picks out those stands on will differ from voter to voter. Different voters will privilege different issues and positions than other voters. And so it'll always be a little bit different, but the whole point is that the individual chooses some sort of heuristic, right? Or some indicator, or something that they believe will illuminate the candidate in a broader way and that they most care about and that they can therefore make their decision based on. This is also memory based. The rational choice, the socialization model, and the fast and frugal model, these are all memory based. This is actually something they have in common. They differ in terms of how arduous and difficult the cognition process involved is, rational choice obviously being the most difficult. But the fast and the frugal variety is equally dependent on the use of the memory to consider those those issues or those items that are deemed relevant to the assessment or the eventual decision made by the voter. And the negative consequences as well as the positive consequences of different alternatives are considered, but the main consideration is efficiency. That is, how can I reach a decision using the fewest pieces of information possible? This is slightly different than self-interest. It may be that the voter believes that those issues are the ones most pertinent to their self-interest, but they're still primarily making a decision based on an assumption of efficiency or a choice of efficiency. And this is something then that makes us think more about those of us who have less time, right? Or maybe those of us who are more inclined to cut corners or to use as little information as possible to make the biggest or the most decisions when we go to the polls. You know, I know, for example, and let me be honest about it, sometimes in primaries or in local elections, I don't even know who most of these people are, right? And so what I do is I'll go and I'll look at, you know, who in what groups and candidates are endorsing, and specifically the ones that the candidates that I already like or the groups that I already trust, and I use those as my heuristics, and I use those as my means of engaging in fast and frugal decision making, and so in this sense, I'm choosing, you know, I'm choosing organizations or candidates whom I already trust, and then kind of thinking about and considering, you know, their takes. And in this way, this is sort of like fast and frugal decision making. And I'm engaging in it because I don't have the time and I don't have the interest in learning about all of these individual candidates running for these relatively you know, small time positions. And so with all the respect to those leaders who do a great and important job, sometimes these local elections, there's just not a lot of information about what's at stake. And or at least compared to presidential elections and primaries, there's often less information. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to that. The experience of, especially if you're in California, by the way, it's the land of a million elections. They happen all the time. And so fast and frugal decision making comes into play often when you feel like you don't have enough information or when you feel like there's just too much work to be done to actually get to where you need to be to make a rational choice or a truly rational choice. And so in the absence of a motivation to engage in a self-interested choice, we engage in what we would think of as a more efficient choice. And this would be the fast and the frugal model. Let's take a look at the fast and the frugal. Teresa, you'll remember that we had our hypothetical voter, Teresa, and Teresa is that soccer mom living. I think I presented this one to you. Maybe I didn't. Let me just read it, and then I'll give you the ones that the parts that I highlighted to indicate that this is an example of fast and frugal voting. So hypothetical voter Teresa C is a soccer mom living in the suburbs of Atlanta. With four kids at home, she has many more pressing things on her mind than politics, her minds, multiple minds. Nonetheless, she believes that a good citizen should vote. She cares about two issues and two issues only: prayer in school and government vouchers for private education. Wonderful. George Bush shares her view on these issues. John Kerry does not. Enough said, choice made. Now go back to the game in other more immediate family members. Um, you may have detected a little bit of sarcasm in my reading of the text. Occasionally that sneaks out. But, you know, since we're here in a public institution and a very fine one, I trust that you all can maybe see my position. But listen, the parts of this description that stand out as indicative of fast and frugal voting are the following. The clause that says she has many more pressing things on her mind than politics. Okay, so she's already engaging in efficiency processing where she's privileging other things and she's only considering those parts of politics that occur to her as relevant given all of the competing priorities she has. And then this other clause, she cares only about these two clauses, I should say. She cares about two issues and two issues only. And those two issues being prayer in school and government vouchers for private education, they could just as easily be environmental protection and expropriation of private businesses. Those are two issues as well. But the point is that this is fast and frugal voting. She's got limited time and she prioritizes other things, yet is still using certain pieces of information to make a choice, right? And ultimately make a decision as she prepares to go to the polls. This is an example of how people engage in what we refer to as satisficing. And it's sort of like the idea that you collect as much information as you need to satisfy some basic requirement or some basic sort of process, right? And if that process is you've got a couple issues that you look at to make your decision, then your process of satisficing involves you seeking out that information along those two different issues and then reaching a decision based on that. This is fast and frugal voting. It's about satisficing, as we would say in the business. And this might be something that you engage in. And I know that when you're busy in life, and frankly, when you have a life, sometimes voting is not a priority. We try to vote, right? But we don't have election day off from school or from work. And many of us have a whole number of responsibilities that would conceivably come before voting, even if we still believe that voting is important. And then it's reasonable then that you would understand and maybe even empathize and even think of yourself in some cases when we think about this need to maybe engage in efficiency voting, given the many demands that we face inside and outside of work and at home and everywhere else. Christopher says, I read them to see if they even followed the rubrics for their information column. Some just say highlights of their life accolades, yet do not give information. The rubrics ask for to give to voters a good picture of their backgrounds. Okay. Oh, I see, Christopher. I see that's your process. Right on. Yeah, no, I know. And I'd love to hear from anyone too. What your process might be, right? Like there are a lot of elections and just a lot of stuff that you don't know anything about. And even if you're very responsible, it gets difficult. They pile up. And especially if you're out of California and you're still voting in California, it could be even more difficult to make those decisions. And so how you go about doing that is probably often going to involve a little bit of everything, maybe some rational choice, but also some efficiency, and some cutting corners. Some may vote fast, others may not. Christopher says he does not vote fast. I personally can remember a time when I have voted fast. And, I don't always want to vote fast. I think that we should have election day off personally. And I don't know how I feel about mandatory voting, but mandatory voting would be okay too. Hey, maybe even we could have mandatory voting and election day off. That's a possibility. But the point is that people have a variety of considerations when they vote, and oftentimes their information processing will reflect, their situation. And so where you are depends on where you sit. There's one last model that we will look at, and this is called bounded rationality or intuitive decision making. And this is sort of similar to Model 3 in that it focuses on making the best decision with the least amount of effort and avoiding trade-offs. but it also focuses on a specific set of cognitive shortcuts and information that people seek out with the idea that it is enough to make a rational choice. And so, whereas in Model 3, the voters are under no illusion that their choice is necessarily a rational or a calculated choice, under Model 4, the bounded rationality model, voters are actually intentionally trying to sort of fill out their information as much as possible so that they can get as close to rational decision making as they possibly can. And the depth of the search is going to be influenced by how important the decision is. And so a primary might be viewed differently than a local election, which might be viewed differently than a presidential election. And election to election might vary as well in terms of other circumstances. But the idea is always that the voter is going to use cognitive shortcuts and certain points or certain things that they'll emphasize heavily and that they'll automatically utilize. As you can see, this is similar to Model 3, but I think the key difference is that it is still intended to be rational. It's intended to be rational. It's just a bounded rationality. And so when we say intuition or intuitive decision making, that's what captures that sort of bounded rationality. When you say that you have an intuition, you're not saying that you have all the information. You're just saying that you have a gut feeling, an instinct, right? Based upon some information that you feel like might be sufficient to make a sort of clear and rational choice. But ultimately, you're combining that limited information with some intuition that you have or some notion that it is the right or the rational choice. This is slightly different than Model 3. And really what you're trying to do is you're making the best possible decision with the least effort, right? And you're avoiding trade-offs. And these shortcuts will involve stereotypes often or schemes, maybe heuristics, other things that you kind of look at as an indicator. Whereas candidate stands on issues and personal attributes are often important in Model 3, stereotypes and views that can be used to sort of assess candidates generally are often used for Model 4. And so this bounded rationality is basically just a diminished form of Model 1 or rational choice because of the explicit emphasis on incomplete information. And so in our discussion and activity on Wednesday, our second voter, Ann D, the business consultant from San Diego, was our bounded rationality voter. And Ann D, remember, said that time is money. And this is the part that I highlighted to indicate that this is indicative of bounded rationality. Anne always says, and even though she believes that candidates have to be evaluated according to the likely consequences of their winning, she feels it is simply not worth the effort to pay any attention to campaigns until near the end. So, in other words, she is sort of inclined to believe that there are sort of objective metrics for assessing the consequences or the possible benefits or costs of different candidates. She nevertheless feels like it's actually just too costly to do so until the very end. And only at the very end does she actually consider those items. And at that stage is she engaged in this process of bounded rationality or intuitive decision making. And so this then is that diminished form of rational choice. And you might say, well, it seems like irrational choice because if it's diminished in the totality of the information is incomplete, how can it be rational? Well, that's why we call it bounded rationality, right? There are limits, there are constraints. It's all about optimizing under constraints. And in this case, Anne views time as the main constraint. And time is naturally going to matter a great deal if you're a voter who doesn't have a lot of time, right? Or perceives your time to be quite valuable. Now, Christopher in the chat said that he does not vote fast. And so I think the lesson is that everyone might be different, right? voters might be rational, they might be um, frugal and fast, they might be partisan, they might be engaged in bounded rationality. You could be any of those things. You could shift and maybe change shape from election to election. And I'd imagine that there are different patterns from election to election and from country to country. And these models then become useful because they give you a way of thinking about voters, and they also give you a way of thinking about yourself. And this is where I want to begin to incorporate you. And we're going to do a poll here that is basically a self-assessment. And I want you to think about, what model does my information processing conform to? What kind of a processor am I? What sort of information processor can I be tagged as when it comes election time, or when I go to the polls, or when I prepare to vote? And if none of these apply to you, I apologize, but I want to kind of shoehorn you into these four choices. Oh no, that should say A, B, C, D. Sorry, it says B instead of D. My bad. You know what I mean. It's been a long day. I always say that when I make these mistakes. But let me launch the poll, and then you can tell me, and I can see for myself. I'm looking forward to the results. So far, a few people are willing to admit that they're fast and frugal, but don't worry, it's anonymous. I can't see your vote. A few of you still out. Like to wait and see if we can get some more responses. So far, I admire your honesty, and I'm not saying that these types of information processing are created differently. It's just that I think I too am one of these. I have to admit it. As difficult as it is to admit. We're nearly done. Three more voters out still, two more. So I think we easily have a quorum. We have 94% in. So I'm going to end the poll, and I'm going to share the results. As you can see, 16 of you, or 47%, tagged yourself as a partisan voter, or as a socialization voter, or one who uses socialization to process information. 6 of you, or 18% of you, said rational choice or economic voting. 6 of you, or 18%, said fast and frugal, and 6 of you, or 18%, said bounded rationality. Now, I admire you because I think that socialization and partisan voting, if we can be honest with ourselves, it's the one that might involve the most baggage, right? We kind of come in with these ideas about who we vote for, and sort of how we vote, and kind of where we fit. And I think even if we don't intend for this to be the case, very often that colors and sort of filters our view and our interpretation of the information. And hey, it could be too that the dissemination of the information and the way that media is evolving is itself partisan. And I think that that's very likely, and that's a whole dimension of this conversation that we haven't even been able to engage with just yet. But really, I think that partisan voting and socialization, it is about cognitive consistency, and it's about that continuity between your past and your present self, and perhaps your future self. Now, some of you, said bounded rationality. An equal number of you said fast and frugal, and an equal number of you said rational choice. And so, it's actually relatively even when you consider that. When you consider that even socialization did not get an actual majority, just barely a plurality. well, a healthy, you know, a large plurality, but still, you can see then that there's quite a spread here. There's maybe a little bit more of a spread than I thought. And so I admire you for your self-assessment. And I wonder if as we go forward, we'll think any differently about information and the way we process it, based on the way we've discussed these different models today. Some of the interesting questions that come up when we deal with this question of information processing and how we process information relate to the different ways that voters process that info, and then the implications for parties and politicians. So think about this. If it's true, and I think that it's fairly accurate, that most voters, even if that's just a plurality, most voters are often engaged in partisan information processing, sort of assessing information through that lens. If that is the norm, and if the plurality of voters are engaged in that kind of process, I think the question for us becomes, what are the lessons for parties and politicians seeking to win votes? What are politicians and parties, what should they do? What are they likely to do if the bulk of us, the lion's share of us, are engaged in this sort of socialized or partisan information processing?
So I think it's interesting to note that at least in California, most local, I think all local elections actually is state mandated that you can't show your party for like city council and or mayor. So I feel like it's harder at that level where the majority of the people are elected for those people to even get known about in the ways of party socialization because you can't see what party they're running under.
Totally. On the flip side, do you think that partisanship then is disproportionately important during, say, presidential elections or legislative elections?
I think absolutely. I think most people, as we saw in the poll, vote based on the party that they see. So partisan alignment is huge for the two major parties.
hmm Yeah. So, as Ishan says, it might have a lot to do with the type of election, right? And many of you have said that the way you behave individually is also shaped by the type of election. And let me point out that that is indicative of your sophistication as a voter and your capacity to, sort of assess the situation and understand the stakes, and understand the difficulty, or the norms around knowing even what party candidates might belong to. So in a local election, partisanship might not mean anything at all. It might be disproportionately unimportant, but maybe information processing based on partisanship becomes disproportionately important in, say, a presidential election or a legislative election. And, maybe in that scenario, there are important implications or lessons for parties and politicians. And Christopher says, say what they want to hear. That is what they do now anyway. And I would argue that that's pretty much true, right? Uh, has anyone seen that episode of Seinfeld where Kramer runs for, like, mayor of the retirement community, and he runs on, like, I can't remember what he runs on, but he runs on what they want to hear, right? And he's like slapping bumper stickers on ambulances and stuff, and he's shape-shifting, and he's behaving in a way that is tailored to the audience, right? And he's trying to tap into those existing preferences, and maybe those existing allegiances, in the same way that partisanship might shape what candidates do and parties do in elections. And Christopher says, canvassing, the first thing they ask for in a nonpartisan elections is, what party are they registered for? Okay, so canvassing, maybe going door to door, maybe pitching your platform through a partisan lens, or maybe um, disseminating information away in a way that is partisan, in a way that is grounded in your partisanship. Everybody, this has been a useful discussion and lecture. I intended for this to be a little exploratory and for me to demonstrate and show you how some of these work and to line up those descriptions from Wednesday with these models. I trust that we took something useful from this, and I learned a lot about you as well. So we are out of time, and as you know, Monday is President's Day, so we won't have class. We will meet on Wednesday. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you on Wednesday.